In September 1939, German warships slipped from their harbors with an air of deliberate menace. Their silhouettes were sharp, modern, and unmistakably martial steel expressions of a nation that believed technology could compress history. To observers along the North Sea and beyond, these ships appeared as instruments of inevitability, forged to challenge an old maritime order that had long belonged to Britain. The Kriegsmarine entered the war, not quietly, but with intent. On paper, their credentials were formidable. Battleships like Bismarck and Tirpitz carried guns of immense caliber, capable of striking at distances that dwarfed most rivals. Their hulls were armored against punishment, their engines tuned for speed and reach. German naval architects, constrained by treaty for years, had poured innovation into every rivet. In staff rooms and intelligence briefings, analysts spoke of these vessels with respect. Some spoke with fear, yet beneath that reputation lay an untested assumption that power alone was enough. Germany had built ships to win decisive encounters, not long wars of attrition. Their designs favored offense over endurance, spectacle over sustainability. They were constructed for moments of dominance, not months at sea. This distinction, subtle at first, would soon become critical. The ocean is not impressed by blueprints. Early operations exposed the strain of prolonged deployment, mechanical failures, fuel limitations, and maintenance demands that German infrastructure struggled to meet. Unlike Britain, Germany lacked a global network. German naval doctrine entered the war shaped by memory and limitation. Cut off from global bases and still rebuilding from treaty restrictions, the Kriegsmarine did not plan to dominate the seas indefinitely. Its ships were conceived as raiders' vessels meant to strike swiftly, disrupt commerce, and vanish before superior forces could respond. Speed was not a luxury. It was survival. Every design choice bent toward the promise of escape. That promise carried a cost. To achieve high speeds, German engineers pushed propulsion systems to their limits. Boilers ran hotter, machinery tighter, tolerances narrower. Heavy armament was mounted on frames never intended for long, punishing deployments. On trials and short operations, the results were impressive. But at sea, far from dockyards, small failures multiplied. A damaged turbine or contaminated fuel system could cripple a ship as effectively as enemy fire. Here, the irony deepened. The features that made these warships feared their acceleration, their reach, their striking power also made them delicate. High-performance machinery demanded constant maintenance. Yet raiders rarely had the luxury of rest. Crews improvised repairs in rolling seas, cannibalized parts, and nursed engines that had been designed for brief exertion, not endless pursuit. Each mile steamed was a calculation between speed and self-destruction. By 1940, operational readiness had become a quiet crisis. Missions were delayed not by enemy action, but by mechanical fatigue. Ships returned early, or not at all, because systems failed under strain. Unlike damage from battle, these breakdowns left no heroism to record, only silence and the slow erosion of capability. Speed, once seen as freedom, began to resemble a trap. A fast ship that could not remain at sea was forced into predictable patterns, returning to port where enemies waited. The raider became the hunted, not because it lacked power, but because it lacked endurance. As German commanders searched for ways to preserve their surface fleet, attention drifted beneath the waves toward vessels that traded speed and spectacle for something far more enduring: time. At first encounter, German warships appeared indestructible. Their hulls cut clean lines through heavy seas. Their turrets rotated with mechanical certainty, and their presence alone altered the calculations of any opposing commander. To those who saw them emerge from mist or horizon glare, they looked like the final answer to naval power machines built to impose order on chaos. But the damage did not begin with enemy shells. It began quietly, in engine rooms and boiler compartments where temperatures climbed and tolerances narrowed. Bearings wore down faster than predicted. Fuel systems fouled under sustained strain. Electrical failures appeared without warning. These were not dramatic failures, but cumulative ones, the kind that do not announce themselves until a ship is already far from help. The irony was stark. The more imposing a vessel appeared, the more complex its internal systems became, and complexity demanded care. German ships carried advanced machinery that required constant attention, yet wartime conditions allowed little margin for error. Maintenance schedules designed in peacetime collapsed under the pressure of continuous operations. What looked invincible from a distance was increasingly fragile up close. Reports from the fleet told a consistent story. Engines overheating, turbines vibrating beyond safe limits, repairs conducted at sea with improvised tools, under blackout conditions, while lookouts scanned for aircraft and shadowing cruisers. Crews worked not only against the enemy, but against time, exhaustion, and mental fatigue. Each breakdown forced hard decisions: continue and risk total failure, or turn back and surrender the initiative. Again and again, ships returned to port early, not defeated, but diminished. Their missions ended not with gunfire, but with mechanical necessity. This quiet retreat eroded confidence, not just in machines, but in the doctrine that had sent them out alone and unsupported. Naval warfare, it became clear, was not decided by firepower alone. It was a contest of endurance, of systems that could survive repetition as much as impact. And as German commanders confronted this reality, they began to look for a weapon that did not rely on constant speed or exposed machinery, a weapon that could wait. From the moment they were launched, German warships were intended to be seen. Their unveiling was deliberate, their lines calculated not only for combat, but for impression. These vessels were symbols as much as weapons, floating declarations that Germany had returned to the ranks of great naval powers. Every silhouette was meant to intimidate, every specification to signal dominance. In the early years of the war, that message landed. Yet the ocean is indifferent to symbolism. Prolonged missions exposed a growing contradiction between appearance and purpose. Heavy guns strained mountings over time. Precision-engineered systems, optimized for short engagements, degraded under constant vibration and salt corrosion. Hulls that looked flawless in harbor revealed weaknesses when battered day after day by North Atlantic seas. What impressed observers did not always endure reality. The irony lay in intent. These ships had been designed to project power quickly and decisively, to overwhelm opponents in carefully chosen moments. But war at sea rarely followed scripts. Instead of brief clashes, German warships found themselves shadowed for weeks, hunted relentlessly, forced to remain at sea long after their systems were meant to rest. The very features that once inspired fear, size, firepower, complexity, now magnified every failure. Crews felt this tension firsthand. Maintenance demands grew relentless. Spare parts ran short. Repairs once expected to take place in dry docks were attempted in cramped compartments, with the ship rolling beneath them. Combat readiness became fragile, dependent not on enemy proximity, but on whether machinery would hold together for another day. Tactical excellence meant little if propulsion failed or radar went dark. In combat, the strain became unforgiving. Designs optimized for decisive gunnery duels offered little resilience when battles extended or turned chaotic. Damage that might have been survivable in simpler ships cascaded through interconnected systems. A single hit or even sustained stress could cripple multiple functions at once. Over-engineering, once a mark of sophistication, became a source of cascading vulnerability. What had been built for the spotlight now struggled in obscurity. These ships were magnificent in brief moments of dominance, but unsuited to the grinding, unglamorous demands of total war at sea. Intimidation did not substitute for endurance. Precision did not guarantee resilience. By the time this realization fully set in, Germany faced a hard truth. Naval power was not measured by how a ship looked, or even how hard it could strike, but by how long it could remain unseen, intact, and operational. And German naval planners entered the war confident that mass and protection would buy time. Thick armor belts, reinforced decks, and towering gun turrets were meant to ensure survival against any opponent bold enough to engage. These ships were not only armed to strike, but built to endure punishment. At least, that was the belief carried from drawing board to dockyard. At sea, the weight of those decisions became literal. Heavy armor strained hulls and propulsion alike, increasing fuel consumption and limiting range. Massive turrets required complex loading systems and constant calibration. Every added ton demanded maintenance, and maintenance demanded infrastructure Germany did not possess beyond its home ports. What looked formidable in a fleet review became a burden during sustained operations. The irony revealed itself slowly. Expectations of long deployments collided with mechanical reality. Ships designed to dominate oceans found themselves tethered to repair schedules. Even minor issues required extended port time, not because damage was catastrophic, but because systems were too intricate to service quickly. Each return to harbor shortened operational windows and narrowed strategic options. Breakdowns became routine. Gearboxes failed. Cooling systems struggled under continuous load. Crews grew accustomed to operating below optimal performance, compensating with caution rather than confidence. These were not failures born of incompetence, but of ambition machines pushed beyond what the environment would tolerate. Overbuilding had created a fleet that could not easily recover from strain. By 1941, a turning point had arrived. German warships were present in theory more than in practice. Their names loomed large in Allied intelligence, but their actual time at sea dwindled. A ship that must constantly withdraw cannot shape events, it can only react to them. Naval power depends not on existence, but on presence. The revelation was unavoidable. Superiority on paper meant little without sustainability. Armor and guns could not compensate for the inability to remain operational. War at sea rewarded designs that accepted limits, not those that ignored them. Endurance, not excess, determined relevance. As German commanders confronted the diminishing role of their surface fleet, attention shifted toward platforms that sacrificed protection for persistence. Beneath the waves, a different philosophy was already proving itself, one that understood the long war was not about being the strongest, but about lasting the longest. German warships were conceived for moments of decision. Their designers imagined battles decided swiftly, range closed, salvos exchanged, the enemy broken by precision and weight of fire. In these moments, the ships performed exactly as intended. Gunnery was accurate, fire control systems advanced, crews drilled for efficiency under pressure. In short engagements, the Kriegsmarine surface fleet could appear unstoppable. The shock came not in battle, but after. When encounters ended and the chase began, the weaknesses surfaced. Sustained high speeds punished engines already operating near their limits. Fuel consumption soared. Minor damage, easily absorbed during brief clashes, became dangerous when compounded over days at sea. Tactical excellence masked an operational fragility that revealed itself only with time. Here lay the irony. By focusing on decisive performance, German designers sacrificed the reliability required for prolonged campaigns. High-output machinery delivered impressive results, but demanded constant care. There was little redundancy, little forgiveness built into the systems. A ship that could win a fight in an afternoon might lose itself over a week of pursuit. Every mission became a calculation against the clock. Commanders weighed not only enemy strength, but the condition of their own machinery. How long could turbines hold? How much strain could the hull absorb? Each additional hour at sea increased the risk of failure unrelated to combat. Victory was measured not just in enemy losses, but in whether the ship could return at all. This struggle shaped decision-making. Aggressive tactics were curtailed. Opportunities passed unexploited because systems could not be trusted to last. The fleet's theoretical power narrowed into cautious maneuver, constrained by maintenance cycles and mechanical uncertainty. The ships remained dangerous, but increasingly predictable. The revelation was sobering. A great design in isolation does not guarantee great performance in war. Naval conflict is not a series of isolated duels, but a continuum of movement, repair, and endurance. Brilliance without sustainability becomes a liability. Precision without persistence fades. As German commanders confronted this reality, they recognized that the future would not be decided by fleeting moments of superiority. It would belong to forces that could operate continuously, unseen and unbroken. And beneath the surface, another arm of the Navy was already proving it understood that truth. For the crews who served aboard Germany's great warships, the war was fought as much with tools and grease as with shells and steel. Every patrol began with a quiet understanding. The enemy was not only somewhere beyond the horizon, but already present within the ship itself. Engines, turbines, pumps, and wiring, all were pushed beyond their intended limits, and all could fail without warning. Men worked in relentless cycles below decks, where heat pressed down and the air tasted of oil and metal. Maintenance never truly ended. A temporary fix at dawn became another emergency by nightfall. Bearings were coaxed through one more watch. Valves were tightened again and again, each turn buying only hours. The ship might look formidable above the waterline, but beneath it was a machine constantly resisting collapse. The irony was unmistakable. These vessels had been built to project fear across oceans. Yet their greatest threat was internal decay. Crews spoke quietly of recurring faults, of systems that could not be trusted under strain. Every successful engagement brought relief, but also anxiety. The ship had survived, but how much had it lost in the process? With each mission, the pressure intensified. Deterioration was cumulative. A propulsion issue left unresolved would strain the electrical grid. Electrical failures compromised fire control. Fire control issues demanded longer exposure in combat. The interconnectedness of modern warships meant that time itself became an adversary. The longer a ship remained deployed, the more likely it was to betray its crew. Commanders were forced into a cruel arithmetic. How much longer could they remain at sea before risk outweighed reward? How many systems could be held together by skill and improvisation alone? These were not questions of courage, but of endurance. The bravest crew could not outrun fatigue embedded in steel. The sea offered no mercy. Salt accelerated corrosion. Cold thickened lubricants. Storms imposed stress no designer could fully anticipate. Even without enemy contact, ships returned bearing invisible damage, misalignments, hairline fractures, components worn just beyond tolerance. Each return to port was both a reprieve and an admission. The ship had not endured. Gradually, a revelation took hold within the fleet. The battle was not only against Allied navies, but against time itself. German warships were racing their own vulnerability, expending strength faster than it could be restored. A weapon that could not remain operational could not shape the war, no matter how fearsome it appeared. As the surface fleet's struggle became undeniable, the contrast grew sharper. Elsewhere in the Kriegsmarine, vessels designed with fewer expectations and simpler demands were staying at sea longer, striking repeatedly, and returning quietly for resupply. They did not impress at launch. They did not dominate in spectacle. But they endured. And in the calculus of total war, endurance was becoming the only advantage that mattered. As German warships pushed farther into contested waters, distance itself became a test. Every additional mile from port magnified the consequences of earlier design choices. Systems that could be tolerated near home became liabilities in the open ocean. What had once been minor inconveniences hardened into operational threats, and flaws that could be hidden during short sorties now dictated survival. The Navy's faith remained rooted in offense. Firepower, speed, and intimidation were still treated as the decisive measures of success. Strategic thinking continued to assume that superiority in combat would offset any structural weakness. But war does not forgive imbalance. A ship that wins an engagement but cannot recover afterward is still lost to the war effort. The irony lay in complexity. Heavy guns required elaborate loading mechanisms. High-speed propulsion demanded precision engineering. Advanced fire control systems depended on stable power and constant calibration. Each layer of capability increased the number of points at which failure could occur. At sea, far from dry docks and specialized technicians, these failures were rarely reversible. Crews felt the weight of this reality daily. Damage control teams trained for battle found themselves fighting leaks caused not by shells, but by stress fractures and worn seals. Engineers labored to keep engines within tolerances that shrank with every hour of operation. Sailors learned to listen for unfamiliar vibrations, subtle changes in pitch that signaled impending failure. The ship became both shield and threat. In combat, the cost was unforgiving. Mechanical unreliability, limited maneuvering at critical moments. Damaged systems slowed responses when seconds mattered. A ship unable to make speed could not disengage. One unable to power its guns or sensors became blind. Losses mounted not solely because the enemy was strong, but because the platform itself could not absorb sustained strain. These were not abstract consequences. Ships were scuttled to avoid capture. Crews were rescued from burning hulls that had survived battle, only to succumb to internal failure. Each loss reinforced a brutal lesson. Design philosophy has human consequences. When function is sacrificed for spectacle, it is sailors who pay the price. The revelation came too late to reverse course. German surface warships had been built for a kind of war that did not exist, a war of short, decisive clashes fought on favorable terms. The real conflict demanded resilience, adaptability, and endurance. Without them, even the most powerful ship became a liability. As the surface fleet's losses accumulated, the Kriegsmarine's future narrowed. Power no longer lay in visibility or intimidation, but in persistence and attrition. The center of gravity shifted away from towering hulls and thunderous guns toward weapons that could endure. By the middle years of the war, the rhythm of Germany's surface fleet had changed. The drama of sorties and engagements gave way to something quieter and more telling: time in port. Dry docks filled with ships that, on paper, still represented formidable power, but in practice required constant attention simply to remain seaworthy. The battlefield had shifted from the open ocean to workshops and repair yards. This was not a failure of courage or intent. It was the consequence of cumulative strain. Systems designed for brief exertion now demanded extended recovery. Hulls needed inspection after every voyage. Engines required overhaul after fewer hours than anticipated. Crews rotated from combat watches to maintenance shifts, trading binoculars for tools. The war at sea had become a war against wear. The irony was stark. Warships meant to impose attrition on the enemy were themselves being worn down by use. Each mission extracted a cost greater than its strategic return. A successful patrol might sink nothing, encounter nothing, yet still require weeks of repair. The ship survived, but its availability shrank. Power was no longer measured by armament, but by readiness. As maintenance demands grew, every decision to deploy became a gamble. Commanders weighed objectives against the risk of mechanical failure far from support. A breakdown at sea could mean exposure to enemy forces, or worse, helplessness. Ships sailed knowing that retreat might not be possible, not because of pursuit, but because systems might not hold. This uncertainty reshaped operations. Missions shortened, routes narrowed. Opportunities passed unchallenged because the cost of pursuit was too high. Tactical thinking yielded to preservation. The fleet existed in a state of cautious survival. Its presence felt more in intelligence estimates than in action. The turning point was subtle but decisive. Naval power ceased to be defined by potential and became defined by availability. A ship in dry dock was a ship absent from the war. No matter how powerful, it could not threaten, protect, or influence events. Maintenance schedules began to dictate strategy, reversing the traditional hierarchy between planning and execution. The revelation followed naturally. Operational success was no longer determined solely by tactics or bravery, but by the ability to sustain machinery under relentless conditions. Victory favored those who could repair quickly, return often, and endure neglect. The German surface fleet, optimized for moments of dominance, struggled in a war that rewarded continuity. By contrast, other naval forces, simpler, less imposing, remained at sea longer. Their designs accepted limitations in exchange for reliability. They broke less often. They returned faster. Over time, they shaped the conflict not through spectacle, but through persistence. As the war moved into its later phases, the margin for error at sea disappeared. Early improvisation gave way to exhaustion. The ocean grew more hostile, not because it had changed, but because time had stripped away the illusion that power alone could prevail. For Germany's surface fleet, simply maintaining a presence beyond coastal waters became an increasingly daunting task. What once seemed manageable now bordered on impossible. Allied patrols tightened, air cover expanded, and intelligence improved. Any breakdown carried immediate consequences. A ship slowed by mechanical failure risked detection, interception, and destruction. Reliability, once assumed as a baseline, emerged as the decisive vulnerability, an absence more dangerous than any enemy weapon. The irony was profound. German warships had been built to dominate engagements, not to survive constant exposure. Their designers had assumed functionality, not questioned it. Yet reliability could not be assumed under conditions of sustained pressure. Every component became a potential point of failure. Every vibration, a warning. What had once been invisible now governed every decision. The turning point arrived quietly. Ships no longer controlled their operations. Operations were controlled by the condition of the ships. Commanders waited for reports from engineers before committing to action. Plans were altered mid-voyage. Missions were aborted before contact. Operational control shifted from the bridge to the engine room. This loss of control eroded initiative. The fleet reacted rather than acted. Surprise, once a weapon, became a liability when mechanical certainty could not be guaranteed. Even when opportunities appeared, hesitation followed. The question was no longer whether the enemy could be defeated, but whether the ship could endure the attempt. The revelation was unavoidable. Naval warfare rewards endurance above all else. Without it, power becomes theoretical. A ship that cannot remain operational cannot shape events, no matter how advanced its design. Guns fall silent. Armor becomes irrelevant. Presence evaporates. This truth reshaped naval thinking across the conflict. Forces that prioritized reliability, simpler systems, easier repairs, predictable performance, gained momentum. They stayed at sea longer, returned faster, and absorbed losses without paralysis. Over time, they dictated the tempo of the war. For Germany's surface fleet, the moment had passed. Reliability had become critical, and it was a requirement they could not meet. The ships remained impressive, but their influence waned with each aborted mission and prolonged repair. They existed as symbols of what might have been, not as tools of victory. As the war pressed on, the seas belonged increasingly to those who could endure them. And beneath the surface, in vessels designed not for spectacle but for survival, Germany would place its last great hope. One that understood endurance was not a feature, but the foundation of war at sea. German surface warships entered the conflict shaped by a specific vision of naval war. They were built for decisive moments, single encounters in which superior speed and firepower would overwhelm an opponent and settle the question quickly. In this framework, endurance was secondary. Victory was assumed to come before where could matter. Reality dismantled that belief with methodical certainty. Prolonged missions revealed stresses that no trial run had fully exposed. Systems designed to perform at peak output for limited periods were forced into continuous operation. Bearings degraded. Seals failed. Electrical loads fluctuated beyond tolerance. The longer a ship remained deployed, the more its internal margins disappeared. The irony was unmistakable. Vessels once regarded as nearly indestructible began to show signs of fragility. Not through catastrophic failure, but through accumulation. A malfunctioning pump led to overheating. Overheating stressed wiring. Wiring failures degraded sensors. What began as a minor defect could cascade into mission-ending damage. Strength became brittleness under repetition. The turning point arrived when breakdowns were no longer anomalies, but expectations. Commanders planned for failure rather than hoping to avoid it. Missions were structured around the likelihood of mechanical loss rather than enemy contact. This shift marked the beginning of defeat, not in battle, but in capacity. A fleet that anticipates its own disintegration cannot impose will on the sea. Pressure magnified every weakness. Allied forces tightened patrols and extended air coverage, leaving little room for mechanical uncertainty. A ship slowed by internal failure was not merely inconvenienced, it was exposed. Each prolonged deployment carried the risk that the ship would not return, not because it had been outgunned, but because it had been exhausted. Crews felt this strain intimately. Watches grew longer. Repairs became improvisations. Confidence eroded as familiar systems behaved unpredictably. Sailors trusted their training, but no amount of discipline could compensate for machinery pushed beyond its limits. The ship ceased to be a reliable extension of its crew and became something to be managed, negotiated with, and feared. The revelation that followed was stark. Sustained naval warfare is not a contest of moments, but of continuity. Firepower wins engagements. Endurance wins wars. Without the ability to operate repeatedly, to absorb stress and return to action, even the most formidable vessel becomes irrelevant. The sea favors what lasts. By the time this lesson was fully understood, options had narrowed. Germany's surface fleet could no longer dictate tempo or location. It reacted, withdrew, repaired, and waited while the war moved forward without it. The vision of decisive surface action faded into a defensive posture shaped by limitation. As attention shifted elsewhere, the surface fleet's role diminished. The future of Germany's naval effort would not lie in ships that sought decisive moments, but in platforms built to survive repetition and neglect. And in that shift lay the final acknowledgement that endurance, not brilliance, defines success at sea. The loss of the sea did not come in a single battle. It unfolded gradually, almost quietly, as German warships failed to remain present long enough for the decisive encounters they had been built to win. Ships sailed, returned early, entered repair, and waited while control of key waters slipped away mile by mile. Power unused is power lost, and absence became the defining feature of Germany's surface fleet. The shock lay in how quickly this absence mattered. Sea control is not claimed by reputation, but by continuity. Shipping lanes are secured not by fear alone, but by constant patrol. As German warships cycled endlessly between sortie and repair, Allied forces filled the gaps. Convoys moved with increasing confidence. Escort networks thickened. Air cover extended outward. The sea adjusted to the rhythm of those who could stay. The irony was unmistakable. German warships had once been admired, even envied for their engineering and ambition. Their designs represented technical mastery and national pride, yet these same qualities now constrained them. Complexity slowed repairs. Weight reduced flexibility. Precision limited tolerance. What had once set them apart now worked against them in a war that rewarded simplicity and repetition. The turning point came when spectacle lost its strategic value. A powerful ship that appears briefly, then disappears for months, cannot influence the course of a campaign. Attrition replaced confrontation as the dominant force at sea. Allied navies did not need to destroy German surface ships outright. Time and pressure accomplished the task more reliably. Every aborted mission, every extended overhaul, quietly shifted the balance. German commanders recognized the change but could not reverse it. The fleet had been built for a different contest. There was no quick redesign, no doctrine that could compensate for ships unsuited to sustained operations. Choices narrowed. The surface fleet became defensive, cautious, reactive. Initiative passed irrevocably to those who could afford to lose ships and replace them. The revelation was sobering in its simplicity. The greatest designs cannot survive if they cannot endure. Naval warfare is not a test of brilliance in isolation, but of systems under repetition. Firepower impresses once. Endurance decides everything afterward. The sea remembers not who struck hardest, but who remained. By the later stages of the war, Germany no longer contested the seas with surface power. Control had shifted decisively. Allied shipping moved in volumes. Germany could no longer disrupt from above the waterline. The ocean had chosen sides, not by ideology or ambition, but by reliability. What remained of the surface fleet stood as a lesson written in steel. Ships built to dominate moments could not shape years. Strength without sustainability proved hollow. And as Germany turned increasingly to weapons of concealment rather than confrontation, the final acknowledgement emerged. The sea is not conquered by spectacle. It is held by those who can endure its demands, return again and again, and remain when others cannot. And in the depths below, away from applause, away from visibility, Germany would make one last attempt to do exactly that. Germany entered the war with a confidence shaped by ambition and belief in engineering supremacy. Naval planners trusted that technical excellence could compress uncertainty, that superior design would compensate for strategic limits and material scarcity. This confidence did not vanish quickly. It endured even as evidence mounted, even as operations faltered, even as ships spent more time moored than moving. The consequences unfolded gradually, then relentlessly. Overestimated strength led to repeated failures, not because plans were reckless, but because assumptions were wrong. Warships were committed to missions they could not sustain. Timelines were built around optimistic projections of endurance. Each failure was treated as an exception rather than a warning, until exception became pattern. The irony was impossible to ignore. The most powerful warships of their era, once symbols of momentum and renewal, became increasingly immobile. They remained intact, heavily armed, and visually imposing, yet strategically irrelevant. Held back by maintenance cycles and operational risk, they stood as stationary monuments to ambition rather than instruments of influence. Strength without mobility became decoration. Overconfidence had shaped design, and design shaped destiny. Engineers pushed boundaries, assuming that mastery over materials could conquer environment and time, but the sea punished excess without discrimination. Complex systems demanded care that wartime conditions could not provide. Margins narrowed, tolerance vanished. What worked in theory failed under repetition. Operational disaster did not arrive in dramatic collapse, but in erosion. Missed opportunities, aborted missions, fleets that never arrived in time to matter. The enemy did not need to destroy these ships outright. Their creators had already limited them by believing too deeply in their perfection. Hubris did not sink the fleet, it anchored it. Crews bore this cost quietly. Sailors trained for combat found themselves guarding harbors. Engineers maintained machines that rarely sailed. Morale eroded not from fear, but from futility. They served aboard vessels meant to change the war, yet watched the war move beyond them. Pride turned inward, then hollow. The revelation that followed was severe but clear. Naval power cannot be willed into existence by confidence alone. It must be supported by systems that endure error, strain, and neglect. Great designs demand humility, an acceptance of limits, an allowance for failure. Without that humility, brilliance becomes fragility. Germany's surface fleet became a lesson written across steel decks and silent gun turrets. It demonstrated that superiority assumed is superiority wasted. The sea does not reward ambition untempered by realism. It exposes it. As the war entered its final years, those once feared ships remained largely untouched by battle, yet absent from decision. They had not been defeated in the way war traditionally records defeat. They had been outlasted, and that, in naval war. For the men who served aboard Germany's great warships, the war was not experienced as theory or doctrine. It was lived minute by minute, in narrow compartments where steel groaned and machinery never truly rested. Veterans would later recall that the greatest fear was not always enemy fire, but the uncertainty of their own ship, whether it would answer the next command, whether it would endure another day. Life at sea unfolded under constant tension. Watches blurred together as sailors moved between stations, alert not only to threats beyond the hull, but to the sounds within it. A change in vibration, an unfamiliar knock, a fluctuation in pressure gauges. These details mattered. They learned to read the ship as one reads a living thing, sensing trouble before it announced itself. The irony was painful and persistent. Courage was never in short supply. Crews trained relentlessly, responded under fire, and worked with discipline in moments of crisis. Yet bravery could not reinforce a cracked bearing or cool an overheating engine. Men could compensate for many things: fatigue, fear, hunger, but not for metal pushed past its limits. The ship, for all its power, imposed boundaries courage could not cross. Veterans spoke of long hours spent repairing systems under conditions never intended by designers. Tools slipped in rolling seas. Parts were reused beyond safety. Makeshift solutions became permanent through necessity. Damage control teams fought leaks not caused by shells, but by stress, fractures, and fatigue. These were battles without glory, fought in darkness, heat, and silence. The psychological weight was heavy. To face an enemy is one burden. To mistrust the platform meant to protect you is another. Sailors knew that a breakdown at the wrong moment could be fatal. A loss of propulsion could mean exposure. A power failure could mean blindness. Survival depended not only on skill, but on whether the ship would cooperate. Many remembered moments when orders were followed flawlessly, only for machinery to falter at the critical point. Retreats delayed, maneuvers slowed, opportunities lost. The ship did not fail dramatically. It hesitated, weakened, compromised, and in that hesitation, danger multiplied. The revelation that emerged from these experiences was deeply human. The men were not defeated by lack of will, but by limitations embedded long before they stepped aboard. They fought not only an external enemy, but ships that resisted the demands placed upon them. Steel and ambition collided, and it was the sailors who stood between them. After the war, survivors spoke without bitterness, but with clarity. They understood that no amount of training could fully overcome flawed assumptions. Ships are promises made to crews. When those promises fall short, it is the men who carry the cost. Their stories endure as reminders that war is not fought by machines alone, nor won by design, brilliance in isolation. It is lived by individuals who trust their lives. They built ships to dominate the seas. They never built them to survive the seas. The distinction is subtle, but decisive. Germany's surface fleet was conceived in the language of power: caliber, speed, armor, reach. Each specification promised control through force. Each launch ceremony reinforced the belief that intimidation and technical excellence could impose order on a chaotic world. For a time, it worked. The ships were feared. Their names carried weight. Their silhouettes altered plans. But the sea does not reward intention. It tests assumptions without mercy and exposes weakness without urgency. Over time, it became clear that domination and survival are not the same ambition. One seeks to overwhelm, the other seeks to endure. Germany's warships were engineered for the first and quietly undone by the second. This is the lesson that emerges when the noise of battle fades. Naval power is not measured by the violence a ship can unleash in a moment, but by how often it can return to sea, how reliably it can function, how predictably it can be trusted by those who serve aboard it. Endurance is not dramatic. It does not inspire awe, but it decides wars. Designs optimized for maximum performance often leave little margin for failure. They assume ideal conditions, perfect maintenance, controlled timelines. War provides none of these. Salt corrodes. Stress accumulates. Improvisation replaces planning. In that environment, simplicity outperforms brilliance. Redundancy outlasts refinement. Reliability becomes strategy. The German surface fleet learned this too late. Its ships were extraordinary achievements of engineering, but poor instruments for a prolonged, attritional conflict. They demanded too much care, too much precision, too much rest. When the war required persistence, they offered spectacle. When it required continuity, they offered moments. This was not a failure of intelligence or effort. It was a failure of philosophy. Power had been prioritized over resilience, appearance over tolerance, control over forgiveness. The result was a fleet that could threaten, but not remain, impress, but not endure. History has repeated this lesson across conflicts and generations. Weapons designed for dominance often falter when asked to last. Systems built for decisive moments struggle in wars of exhaustion. The difference between success and irrelevance is rarely found in peak performance. It is found in survivability under strain. For the sailors who served aboard these ships, this truth was lived, not theorized. They trusted machines that could not always be trusted in return. They compensated with skill and courage, but courage cannot replace endurance. When systems fail repeatedly, even the bravest crews are reduced to waiting for repairs, for orders, for relevance. In the end, the German surface fleet was not destroyed in the way war myths prefer. It was not decisively crushed in a final engagement. It was worn down, sidelined, and overtaken by a conflict that moved on without it. The sea did not defeat it with violence. It defeated